So today was another day of trial in the DePuy ASR case, the first one to be tried in the country down in Los Angeles. And today, uh, the plaintiffs spent much of their case introducing the medical evidence from doctors who were actually involved in the treatment of Mr. Kransky. Um, uh, the first witness to testify was the surgeon who actually put the ASR into Mr. Kransky. And he gave some very positive testimony for the plaintiffs. He acknowledged that had he known that there were reports of problems with this hip, he probably wouldn't have used it. He acknowledged that he saw advertising that was very misleading about the hip, and that advertising was the reason, one of the primary reasons he decided to use the ASR hip. He also acknowledged that had he been told about the high incidence of reports of high cobalt and chromium in people who had these hips, he never would have used it. And so on those points, he was very good. He also acknowledged that the hip that was installed into Mr. Kransky was, in his mind, was the appropriate hip, that Mr. Kransky didn't have any, even though he was sick, even though he had diabetes and some other health issues, that did not disqualify him as a candidate to receive this hip. So um, uh, that testimony was very good. The testimony that I think was probably the most shocking from the standpoint of people who had these hips put in was the testimony from the implanting surgeon about his interactions with the DePuy sales representative. And what he said was that after he had installed the hip into Mr. Kransky, um, and it was actually, he testified very specifically, it was in January of 2010. He had a meeting with his sales rep in Montana, and the sales rep in Montana told him that the DePuy ASR hip was going to be pulled from the market because of all the problems with it, and that he shouldn't use it anymore. And what's very shocking about that is that this hip was not recalled until August of 2010, 8 months later. We have many clients who had surgeries between January and August of 2010. And I'm sure there were probably thousands of people who got the ASR during that time period. And so that was very, very interesting testimony that I'm sure is going to make a lot of headlines. The other testimony yesterday came from the surgeon who performed the revision surgery on Mr. Kransky. That testimony was interesting in a bunch of respects, and it really highlighted on cross-examination. We got a sort of a glimpse of what the defendants intend to argue in this case. It appears, based on that cross-examination, that they will be arguing that Mr. Kransky was suffering from an infection that occurred at the very beginning when that hip was put in from day one, and was festering in essence for years before the hip came out. And that's why Mr. Kransky was having pain and problems with the hip, and that's why it had to be removed, not because of any defect with the ASR's design. And so that's really going to be their defense in this case, that Mr. Kransky had an infection, and that this hip would have had to come out no matter what. There's a lot of facts that will, I think, come out as this trial proceeds to show that Mr. Kransky most likely did not have an infection. First of all, the surgeon, when he went in and took the hip out, he took cultures when he first went in, and all of those cultures grew negative, which means there was no organisms or bacteria seen in the cultures from Mr. Kransky's hip. That is definitely a sign that he didn't have an infection. But what makes it a little complicated is that a couple days after the surgery, Mr. Kransky developed a hematoma, which is in essence a collection of blood in the wound where he had the surgery. And at that point, the hematoma was drained, and what was drained was cultured. So this is a few days after his revision surgery. And what was cultured showed that he had staph bacteria in the wound. Um, so the defendants will likely argue that that staph infection was there the entire time, while the plaintiff's experts will most likely argue that that staph infection didn't show up until after the revision surgery. That he had an open wound. Staph is a bacteria that lives on the skin. It's a very common type of infection to get after a surgery. And so any infection that he had occurred after the revision surgery, not before. And so that's going to be a fundamental causation issue in the case. So today was a day that was primarily um, testimony from surgeons, a lot of medical terminology, a lot of medical facts. All the testimony occurred by videotape because the surgeons are in Montana, which I think tends to put a lot of jurors to sleep when they have to watch video all day. But it was I think overall a good day for the plaintiffs, and we'll see what happens next.